And so we gather for this Easter time, this Easter day, this day of celebration, a day when we rejoice in Christ arose and that he is Lord. And of course, because he rose, our salvation is assured. And yet on that first Easter morning, Mary Magdalene was crying. So why were there tears on this day of rejoicing? To many, Mary of Magdala is one of the most interesting women of the Bible because she portrays the transition from extreme darkness into the most brilliant light. The first person to encounter the risen Jesus and believe was Mary Magdalene. She, together with Mary, the mother of James and Salome, had reported the empty tomb to the disciples and had then wandered back to the garden in bewilderment. She had watched the crucifixion. She had seen Jesus wince and cry out as the nails entered his flesh. She had heard him call for water and watched as he breathed his last breath. She watched as the body had been carried to the garden tomb. Determined to put spices on his body, she had risen early and come to the garden only to find the tomb open and the body gone. She'd expected the worst. She'd come to do the work of an undertaker, and her discovery seemed to confirm her doubts. And now she stood crying in front of the tomb. Now, we know very little about Mary before her part in the drama of the cross and resurrection, apart from Luke's reference to her when Jesus had cast out 7 demons from her, and that she, along with Joanna, the wife of Chuza, and Susanna, were supporting the work of Jesus and his disciples with their own money. She came from the town of Magdala, and Jesus had rescued her from a physical or a spiritual bondage that had held her captive and controlled her life. She was beginning to know deliverance through Jesus. She followed him out of gratitude. Her life was now centered on him, and she couldn't do enough for him. From being helped came her desire to help. During the crucifixion and burial, she wouldn't let Jesus out of her sight. And so after a sleepless and distraught Sabbath, she was first at the tomb. As she cried at the tomb, she said to the angels, "They've taken my Lord away and I don't know where they've put him." In her grief and her single-minded devotion, she even mistook Jesus for the gardener. For some time, she had followed him, supported him, loved him, depended on him, devoted her life to him, and now, distracted, weeping, and bewildered, she couldn't find him. Well, I think in today's world there are those people who are like her. They've known God's love and their lives have changed dramatically. They've experienced the joy and wonder and excitement of following Jesus, and at one time they couldn't do enough for him in return. Like Mary, they were entirely devoted. And then something happens in their personal life that leaves a great hole that seemingly nothing can fill. Certainties that they thought they could count on. A Christian faith, a loving marriage, a steady job. These things fall apart before their eyes and nothing seems certain any longer. And so, like Mary, standing helplessly by the cross, unable to stop what was happening, they've been made to suffer events that they couldn't control. They struggle under sorrow, loss and depression, distracted, weeping and bewildered like Mary. They've lost their way back to resurrection, faith and life. Many, like Mary, are defeated by their doubts. Mary doubted the Lord's promise. She doubted his power, and she doubted his presence. So how do we get back to life and light from depression? How did Mary find her way? Well, first of all, she went to the right place and she spoke to the right people. She was there where she had last seen Jesus. And 3 times she goes back to the tomb, even when everyone else had given up. She spoke to the disciples and told them her grief about the missing body. She asked the angels where he was. And then she asks Jesus, even though she mistakes who he is. But what do we do when we're feeling low sometimes and we have situations that we need to feed on and we don't want to get over things? But that wasn't the case with Mary. Instead of staying home alone without talking to anyone and nursing her grief in isolation or making complaints to the wrong ears, Mary actually goes to the right place. She kept asking the right questions to the right people. Mary realised Jesus' personal knowledge of and care for her. She didn't find him, he found her. And like Mary, there are times when we too may have lost our way. We may not know where to begin looking, or we may not even want to look. And yet Jesus is already there with us, calling us by name. I remember hearing the story of a social worker taking a survey in a rundown part of the town. He knocked on one particular door and a woman answered, and he simply asked, "How many live in this house?" So the woman replies, "Well, there's Jimmy and there's Mary, there's Bobby and there's Sadie." And the man interrupts and says, "Just give me the numbers." The woman replies, "There are no numbers in this house. They are all names to me." And we are all names to God. Jesus tenderly asked why Mary was calling, and then he called her by her name. And at that point, she recognised him. Mary had to learn what was and was not possible. When she recognised Jesus, she cries out, "Rabboni," meaning teacher, and she goes to cling to him. Her form of address suggests Mary's desire to resume the old attitude and relationship with Jesus. She wanted to return to the way things had been before he died, caring for him, providing for him, following him. Now she could shut out the nightmare of the last 3 days. Everything would be as it had been before. And yet it couldn't be. Jesus now had a resurrected body. There would have to be a new relationship now. And it's the same for us. Past relationships and experience will change. And we're seeing that as we move out of COVID. Things are not going to be exactly as they were. We now have to learn to live with what is. But Mary had to get rid of her old view of God. Mary couldn't recognise Jesus. Face to face with the risen Lord, she took him for the gardener because she was looking for a dead human body rather than a resurrected one. And in the same way, we often look for God in one form, and yet when he comes to us in another, we fail to recognise him. Finally, Mary had to trust in the new and unique relationship with God through Jesus. When speaking of the Father, Jesus had previously referred to my Father. His sonship was unique, but now he was extending that unique sonship to Mary and to the disciples and indeed to all who would believe. He says to her, "Go to my brothers and tell them, I am returning to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Mary was given a job to carry out for Jesus. She was given direction. The cross and the resurrection changed forever our relationship with God. It made us children in that unique family of God. And we read in Romans 8, you received the spirit of sonship, and by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. May we, like Mary, come into that family with confidence, believing that God is our Father, that he loves us, and that his love never changes. For only then can we discover the new relationships, define the new possibilities, and find the God who is there for us, as he was for Mary, on the other side of her depression and doubt. There's an invitation to all people to come to Jesus. He is alive, and we can trust him and move from our tears and distress into that place of triumph. May that be the reality for all of us this Easter Day. God bless you.
Just because He